indeed for having me here this morning. Shall we pray? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. 100 years ago this year, the First World War broke out. For most of us, 100 years ago is an unbelievably long time, and those things are past and gone. That war still shapes us. It was the death of many empires. It ended the German Empire. It ended or transformed the Russian Empire. It ended the Ottoman Empire. We're still picking up those pieces. Probably it ended the British Empire in time. And it also ended one we often forget, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That really sounds very old and distant to us. But 100 years ago, it stretched from Switzerland to Russia. It was not that long ago. The son, Otto von Habsburg, the son of the last empress and emperor, died 2 years ago. The last empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Empress Zita, died in 1989. And Austria, though she was no longer an empress, and Austria is now a republic, could not carry out an official state funeral, but it reenacted the funerals which the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian emperors and empresses had had for centuries. And in 1989, they gathered in St. Stephen's Cathedral in the heart of St. Stephen's Square in Vienna and had a funeral mass translated into all the languages of the empire: German, Hungarian, Croatian, and 20 others. After the funeral service was over, the procession bearing the coffin was led out of the cathedral, down behind St. Peter's Square, to a large wooden gate. And behind the gate is a Capuchin monastery, into which for centuries the emperors had been buried. And they reenacted the ceremony. The marshal of the funeral procession knocks loudly on the door, and the abbot, with all the monks inside, says, "Who seeks to enter?" Then the marshal of the funeral procession read what is called the long title of the Empress Zita, listing her titles as empress, as queen, as duchess, as archduchess, and many others. This takes 10 minutes. At the end of this, the abbot behind the door says, "We don't know her." Who seeks to enter? 1989, they skipped the middle title, which takes 2 minutes, and then went to the short title. And when asked who seeks to enter, said, "Zita, the Empress of Austria, the Queen of Hungary, the Queen of Bohemia." And the abbot says, "We don't know her. Who seeks to enter?" And then the marshal of the procession says, "Zita, your sister, a poor sinner." And then the door is open. And Zita went to join centuries of Habsburg emperors who were buried under the same condition: that no emperors enter here, no kings enter here, no queens or dukes enter here, only brothers and sisters and sinners. And the Habsburgs could be royal enough, but at least this ceremony and many others enacted a theological critique of worldly power. That yes, you wield all these things, but actually there's only one king here, and that is Jesus. Sunday of the reign of Christ, the kingship of Christ, is actually next week. But I asked next week's preacher, Reverend Lynn, could I trespass a little to pick up on this theme? And so we had the readings this morning in the first chapter of Revelation, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the reign of all. Or John 18, when Pilate's questioning Jesus. What is Pilate questioning about? Kingship. So this is also the month that Lynn mentioned when tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of churches around the world are particularly seeking to remember and pray for Christians who are currently persecuted this year in 2014. And these two themes, the kingship of Christ and persecution, are related. Of course, there are other reasons why Christians are persecuted. I mean, religiously persecuted. Of course, Christians, like anyone, can be persecuted for the wrong race, the wrong political party, or anything. Here I'm talking about things connected to faith. In most such cases, it's because it's a refusal to accept some particular temporal power. Wanting to be good citizens, but never accepting an earthly authority as the final authority. And this is what we find in Jesus' trial before Pilate. Pilate wasn't that worried about Jesus claiming to be the Messiah. I mean, one of those would pop up every few years. Many who were quieters were off in the desert. So that wasn't the problem. What is the problem? A Messiah who claims to be a king. And not just any king, lots of kings around. Herod was a king, but he was subordinate to the emperor. He was subordinate to Pilate, the governor. But Jesus was saying, no, that's not the case. A different kingship, a kingship not from this world, but not subordinate to Caesar. Romans were very sharp on such matters. That was trouble. That's why, in their own mind, that's why the Romans crucified Jesus. Claim of kingship. Or another example which will come to us in Advent. You remember Herod? The wise men come to him. They've seen the star, they followed the star. They mention several things to Herod, but one of them is that a king is born. Now, Herod's a king. Kings really don't want other kings roaming around in the same place. So Herod resolved to kill all of the firstborn in order to kill Jesus. Remember Jesus' birth. There were people out, when Jesus was born, there were people out there hunting to kill him. And the Holy Family fled into Egypt to escape that. So the theme of the kingship of Christ has many resonances within and way beyond the Bible. Sometimes we miss this. It's interesting that many other people don't. Many commentators in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and elsewhere, when they look at the collapse of the communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc in 1989, 1990, maintained it was a major factor was the role of the church in maintaining a zone of independence in the society. Free as much as possible from government control, it preserved a realm of freedom. Not necessarily out of a huge desire for religious freedom, but at least to protect itself. This was an important factor. One of the groups of people who picked up on this was the Chinese government. In 1992, the Chinese state-run press ran an article which said that the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, a major factor in that collapse was the role of Christianity in the church. And Chinese Communist Party newspaper went on, and I quote, "If China does not want such a scene to be repeated in its own land, it must strangle the baby while it is still in the manger." It's interesting that whoever wrote that read the Bible and also expected the readers to get the allusion to Herod. Herod must be our role model, or we might go the way of the Soviet Union. China has tried a sort of policy of strangulation of the church. Now it's more of a sort of suffocation, a control, not wanting to get things out of hand. That policy in China has failed as spectacularly as almost any public policy. In China, in the last 30 years, you've had the largest pattern of church growth in human history. Any age, any country, any time. Conservative estimates by not just wild claims by some preachers, but conservative estimates by sociologists who are working very diligently on this, but a conservative estimate of the number of Christians in China at about 80 million, which is approximately 40 times what it was 30 years ago. And Yang Feng, who is probably the leading sociologist studying this, believes that in 20 years, China may have more Christians than any other country in the world. But yet, many of those Christians are suffering. We should not forget that. And this means we should also remember that Christianity is not predominantly a Western religion or white people's religion. We've just mentioned the example of China, but of the world's 10 largest Christian communities, countries with the largest number of Christians, only 2 of those, Germany and the United States, are in the industrialized world. Most in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, China. We mentioned China, we mentioned Russia, the Philippines, Nigeria, Ethiopia. These are the large Christian countries in the world. This is true in the modern age, but it's also true historically. Again, it's always good to remind ourselves that the presence of the church throughout the world, again, is not new. The church, before Paul was called to go to what we now call Europe, when he set foot went over to Greece, the church was already well established in Egypt. Remember, that's where Jesus grew up, laying from heaven. Also in Ethiopia, what is now Sudan. After I finish speaking, we will recite the Nicene Creed. The principal author of that creed, Athanasius of Alexandria. We would now call him an Egyptian. Or perhaps the greatest theologian of the West, Augustine, St. Augustine, grew up in the Roman province of Africa. He lived in what is now Algeria. So the presence of Christianity on the continent of Africa is not new. Or the church in India did not arrive with the British invasions. If you go to the south of India or southeast in Chennai, you will find a very large burial site to St. Thomas. That is, doubting Thomas, who said he would not believe in Jesus, and then he could put his fingers in the hole of his hand. And the Indian churches and the Iraqi and the Iranian churches say that Thomas came through and preached, and he was the founder of that church. It's hard to pin that down historically, whether St. Thomas actually made it to India. But what we do know is the churches are that old. Someone made it to India in the 1st century. And the Martoma and other churches are 2,000 years old. Or to take China and the United States. The church in China is far older than the church in the United States. We have Christian archaeological sites from China from the 7th century, established by missionaries from what is now Iran. So we are members not only of Saint James, members not only of the Episcopal Church in the United States and beyond, or of our fellow churches in Warrenton and elsewhere, but we're members of an ancient, historic, universal, worldwide church of Christians in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America, and elsewhere. And also, this is a church which in many areas is persecuted. Again, now there are very detailed sociological studies of these matters. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which is probably the best source of statistics on any religion and any religious topic, maintains that Christians are the most widely discriminated against and harassed religious group in the world, as Christians. Not talking about harassment because of race or other factors. In the last 10 years, it's taken place in some 151 countries. That's 3/4 of those countries. That's dealing with discrimination, harassment, and so on. If one looks at religion-related violence, that's currently occurring in about 40 countries. And in many parts of the world, such as the Middle East, this is increasing. Obviously, we can't hope to go through all or even most of these examples. They occur in many parts of the world. Probably North Korea is the most repressive of Christians, and indeed of any religions, the most repressive of human beings. But practicing the Christian or the possession of a Bible can get you killed or have your entire family put into a labor camp. Nigeria is probably the country where most Christians are killed in relation to their faith. Boko Haram, of which you will have heard, it attacks the military, it attacks the government, but one of its particular targets are Christians. Remember those 250 girls who were kidnapped? They were from a Christian village. There may have been some Muslims again with them, but the prominent target for those girls was that they were Christians. But I've mainly focused on a situation which has been worsening rapidly in recent years, and that's in the Middle East. This we see in our headlines each day, particularly with ISIS. As you know, it has been killing many Christians and Yazidis and Shiites and others. But in many parts of the Middle East, the last 5, 10, 15 years, I've seen a real downturn in the situation of Christians. Last year, between August the 14th in Egypt, between August 14 and August 16, some 200 Christian churches and religious-related buildings were attacked, and 60 of them destroyed utterly in the space of 3 days. There are some 10 million Christians in Egypt. That's not just business as usual. This is the worst attack on Egypt's Christians in the last 700 years. I mean, things have often been bad for them, but 30 years ago, Muslims were not going around attacking Christians, burning down churches in Egypt. So there's been a growth in more radical and extreme forms of Islam. We see that. We see Christians being targeted by all sides in Syria, and now more recently in Iraq. In the last 11 years, some 3/4 of the Christians in Iraq, and these are ancient Christian communities, they go back 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years. 3/4 have fled. And many of those that remain, they are refugees in the north. And many people targeted by Christians targeted by ISIS are already refugees who fled to the Kurdish areas. So the Middle East situation is particularly urgent, and many of the Christian and also Yazidi refugees are in northern Iraq, which is quite mountainous. In winter, it's very cold and it freezes to death. So there's particular concern now for the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of refugees who are at the moment destitute. And I think that calls for particular attention. And if I may just tell one other story, which is a little chilling. Last December, Lynn and I were in Rome, and I was speaking at a conference at the Vatican on this theme. And one of the other speakers was the recently appointed Archbishop Zarko. He was the senior Chaldean, that is, Iraqi Catholic Archbishop. Also, he's the patriarch of Iraq and the patriarch of Babylon. His seat, his official residence is Baghdad. He cannot go there. He was not by ISIS, but by other militias in the country. He spoke and gave from our overview of the situation, a very careful man. But he also lamented the silence of many other Christians, especially Western Christians. He says, we don't seem to hear anything, either from them to others or to us. And now back. He's in northern Iraq. So how do we respond to this? Difficult news. It's not all bad news. There are very many things we can do. And many of you are already doing these things. But just to mention a couple of things. One I mentioned, as we see in Iraq, we see in Syria, we see in Egypt, we see in Iran, the growth of more extreme forms of Islam, which is leading to persecution of other Muslims, other religious minorities, Yazidis, Mandaeans, others, and Christians. And so we may be looking at the possible disappearance of Christians from those old communities. How do we counter these? Well, one longer term thing is how can the forms of extremist Islam growing then be displaced? One country in which I'm working a lot is Indonesia, which is a world away from us and from the Middle East. But it's the world's largest Muslim country. The forms of Islam in Indonesia are predominantly and famously very open and tolerant. I'm a professor at the largest Islamic university in Indonesia. Which isn't bad, because I'm not a Muslim, I don't speak Indonesian, I don't speak Arabic. And that didn't seem to be a problem. I work on religious freedom there. And the Indonesians, as Muslims, are greatly concerned, saying, there ain't going to be peace in the Middle East as long as these are the forms of Islam which dominate. We can have ceasefires and military things and all. It's just that the basic structure, if you have this form of extremism, it's just going to erupt in other ways. And we believe the sorts of Islam we practice in other places too, Jordan, in Morocco, much of Africa. And that needs to have more influence. So this is the thing we're working on. Actually, the Indonesian government's opening schools and running training programs in various parts of South Asia and the Middle East. So in longer term, changes in the dominant form of Islam, which of course can only be done by Muslims, but with our help and encouragement whenever we can. That's one dimension. We also, here, Syrian Muslims are American citizens, should push on our government to act. I mentioned winter's coming. There's a very urgent need for just basic relief supply, food, medicine, supplies, which can be administered and passed on to the Kurdish areas. Our government and many others are doing work on that, but that could be increased. There are many other wonderful private organizations working with those refugees and others in the Middle East that contain very many of them. But here I'll just mention one, and also a very inspiring man. That is fellow Episcopalian Canon Andrew White, was sent by the Archbishop of Canterbury as a special representative of the Middle East, where he stayed. And Canon White is usually now known as the Vicar of Baghdad, the Vicar of Saint George's Church in Baghdad, though again now he cannot go near the place. But he's done amazing work, does amazing work with Christians and Muslims, and speaks very much about what goes on in that area. And he's already, this is not because I'm speaking today, it's already the case. If you go to Saint James's website and look at links, and look up Saint George's Church, Baghdad, you will find an introduction to that church and to Canon White's ministry, which is amazing and miraculous. He's a man with very many chronic illnesses. Works there, is now working in the North. And he's a man whose ministry, many others too, but he's closer to us ecclesiastically, whose ministry deserves support. And also reading his story and reading stories of others will be inspiring to us. There's a lot of suffering which I'm talking about, but there's a lot of inspiration and heroes and encouragement which we can get from this. And lastly, in a way, encompassing the other parts, remembering what Archbishop Zaka said. For us always to be aware of, to remember what is happening. Many people in these countries will tell you, often the hardest thing is, there's food, there's poverty, there's struggle, there's violence. why is it nobody knows and nobody cares? This is just, we're isolated, forgotten. So to remember, to ask encouragement, and to pray, this is a duty on each of us. May God always move us to remember our sisters and our brothers